Welcome back to episode 9 of our Explainer. Today, we're tackling something truly monumental, the Battle of Verdun. This was the longest and really, arguably, the most brutal clash of all of World War I. It was the kind of conflict that completely redefined the horrors of combat, taking it from a war of movement and turning it into this grim, mechanized slaughterhouse. In fact, it was so relentless that the French soldiers morbidly nicknamed it the Meuse Mill. Now, I want you to just let this number sink in for a second. 10 million. That staggering figure represents the estimated number of unexploded arsenic-laced shells that are still buried in Verdun's soil today. Over a century later, and bomb-clearing units are literally still removing about 40 tons of unexploded munitions from this area every single year. It is this permanent, toxic scar of a conflict that is quite literally still poisoning the European soil. All right, here is our roadmap for the Explainer. We'll start with Bleeding France White, then A Storm of Steel, The Sacred Way, Hell on the Meuse, Relief at the Somme, and we'll wrap up with An Enduring Legacy. Part 1. Bleeding France White, The Strategic Folly of 1916. So to understand Verdun, you have to look at the absolute stalemate of trench warfare on the Western Front by late 1915. The whole cult of the offensive had completely failed, breakthroughs were basically impossible, and because of that, the German Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, adopted this terrifying new strategy. He wanted to bleed France white. His goal actually wasn't to gain ground. He just wanted to annihilate the French army. He decided to substitute firepower for manpower, essentially deciding that the sole objective of this battle was to just kill as many Frenchmen as possible until their entire nation's morale broke. Now, you might be wondering, out of the entire Western Front, why target Verdun? Well, it was a symbol of immense national pride for France. It held this almost mystical significance, dating all the way back to the Franco-Prussian War. Tactically speaking, it was also a very vulnerable salient, basically a bulge into German territory that threatened their communication lines. Falkenhayn knew, he absolutely knew that the French would throw every single man they had into defending it just for reasons of prestige. He was drawing them into a trap they simply couldn't walk away from. Which brings us to part 2. A Storm of Steel, the Industrial Barrage. To execute a grim strategy like that, the Germans couldn't just rely on infantry anymore. They brought in an unprecedented concentration of industrial weaponry. If you look at the numbers, the French were severely outgunned. We're talking about a staggering 4-to-1 German superiority in artillery before the battle even kicked off. French military intelligence had been completely fooled by German deception plans. The Germans had secretly moved over 1,200 heavy and super-heavy guns to the Verdun salient, built bomb-proof shelters, and just held their fire until the trap was perfectly set. And then, the trap springs shut. 2 million. That is the number of shells the Germans fired in just the opening 8-hour bombardment on February 21st, 1916. An 8-hour apocalyptic storm of steel. And it wasn't just high explosives either. The Germans rolled out devastating new weapons. This was actually the very first time flamethrowers were used in battle, and the artillery was raining down phosgene gas, this horrible asphyxiating chemical agent that caught the French completely off guard. Let's move to part 3, the Sacred Way, Logistics and Leadership. So surviving this overwhelming barrage required masterful logistics. Because the standard rail lines were completely severed by the bombardment, the French were left incredibly vulnerable. Their only lifeline became the Voie Sacrée, or the Sacred Way. This was a single widened road, and think about this. It handled a truck passing every 14 seconds, day and night. It was relentlessly ferrying troops, 48,000 tons of ammunition, and vital supplies directly into the salient. Without this single artery, which was constantly being repaired by labor battalions, just throwing crushed stone right into the mud, Verdun would have absolutely fallen in a matter of weeks. But of course, supplies aren't enough when the men themselves are breaking. This is where General Philippe Pétain comes in. His organizational genius with what's called the Noria system is a huge reason the defense held. Instead of leaving units on the line until they were completely wiped out, he rapidly cycled almost the entire French army through the battlefield, pulling them out after just a few days. Yes, it spread the horrific trauma across the entire army, but it prevented the total physical and mental collapse of his frontline forces. Okay, part 4. Hell on the Meuse, the human toll. I want to zoom in on the micro level here because the visceral, unimaginable horror experienced by the individual soldiers is just, it's hard to even comprehend. Look at this quote from French infantryman Louis Barthès. He perfectly captures that intense psychological emasculation of industrial warfare. Unlike in past wars where human courage might actually win the day, these men felt utterly powerless against the machinery. They felt like insignificant components being fed right into a meat grinder that they had absolutely no control over. And the environment itself basically became a second enemy. The sensory nightmare was absolute. Soldiers were living in this pulverized moonscape of craters. They literally couldn't walk without stepping on decomposing bodies. The stench was so unbearable, it permeated their food and their drinking water. The unrelenting dread, the deafening noise, it shattered the nerves of soldiers on both sides, causing catastrophic levels of shell shock and psychological trauma that we can barely fathom today. Part 5. Relief at the Somme, a desperate diversion. The unbearable pressure on the French at Verdun naturally had a ripple effect across the entire war. The Allies had to initiate a massive countermeasure somewhere else on the Western Front, just to prevent a total French collapse. So as you can see on the timeline, by July, the British launched the Battle of the Somme. This was done specifically to divert German guns and reserves away from Verdun. Originally, the French were supposed to play a massive role at the Somme, but Verdun had drained them so completely that it ended up being a predominantly British operation. And here is the truly tragic irony of 1916. The Somme was designed to relieve the slaughter of Verdun, right? But it ended up becoming an even larger bloodbath. The British disastrously suffered over 57,000 casualties on the very first day alone. But, strategically speaking, it did eventually succeed in its primary goal. The immense pressure of the Somme forced the Germans to halt their offensives at Verdun and redirect their artillery, which finally took the boot off the neck of the French army. Finally, Part 6, an enduring legacy, Scars of the Meuse. By the time the guns at Verdun finally fell silent in December 1916, after the French had managed to claw back their lost forts, the landscape and the men who fought there were forever changed. Let's just look at the final tally. 10 months of fighting, around 800,000 casualties combined. And for what? A maximum territorial gain of just 5 miles of pulverized mud. With 70% of casualties inflicted by artillery, meaning men were dying without ever even seeing the enemy face to face. The sheer futility of it all broke the morale of so many. The trauma ran so deep that when ordered to launch new offensives in 1917, massive mutinies swept right through the French army. They just flat out refused to throw their lives away in futile assaults ever again. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to chew on. What are the consequences for humanity when warfare evolves into a pure industrial machine and human lives merely become its fuel? Falkenhayn's strategy of attrition fundamentally changed the nature of conflict. Verdun stands today as a monumental warning about the terrifying logic of industrial warfare, a battle that literally and metaphorically still poisons the soil and the memory of Europe today. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.